Open your ears and crack some beers. You are listening to episode 32 of Retro Hangover.
And hello, Internet. We welcome you over the streaming service of your choice, whatever that might be. But today we are deliberately dropping diplomatic discourse despite doubts dumbing down debate. Don't deliberately divide from this podcast, the Retro Hangover podcast. And I'm your co-host, Chris Copleen. And here is your host, Shane Dick Dragon Doggo Koski.
You know, I'm going to say that in like a weird roundabout way, I feel like that's a compliment. If you think about the logistics of the dragging of the dong, I feel like you're saying something, and I appreciate that.
That is a compliment. You're my dick dragon dog, bro.
I feel like if we had a more like wider audience, that would be one of those moments where I get stuck with a nickname for the rest of time.
You never know. That's why they archive. That's why archives exist.
I'm fully expecting someone like, maybe Sam or Superfan Sam or Lyle, somebody like that, to just start dropping that in our comments all the time. That's not an invitation, by the way.
It is an invitation. Please do.
Damn it.
You will get the heart symbol on Facebook for doing it, and one of those heart likes on Instagram from my personal account. If you continue to call Shane Dick Dragon Shane.
I will poop emoji every one of those. I promise.
like Angry Video Game Nerd. Remember Mike Matei? When he was known as Big Dick Mike forever, or whatever he was called, because I don't know why, but it was just that thing.
Well, that's kind of like when the Game Grumps came to Jacksonville when they were doing the Game Grumps live thing, and we coined the nickname for Aaron that stuck for a while, which was Aaron Thick Bitch Hansen.
So there you go. You got your nickname. Fans of the show, please mobilize and make it popular.
I am simultaneously okay and disturbed by this. I don't know how to feel.
You should feel honored. You have a nickname.
So anyway, how you doing, Chris? What you been up to besides, I'm assuming, more of the school works?
Yeah. So this class is almost done, and like I think I said this last time, fuck this class, because I cannot say that enough times. Fuck this class, fuck this class, fuck this class.
Yes, I do recall that.
So I've sent a copy of my final to Shane to review, because he has been through the colleges, and he has the experiences. So hopefully he gives me some good feedback, but I don't want to talk too much about that. I did spend...
I'm just going to draw dicks all over it.
Please do.
Just big, veiny, magnificent bastards.
Just go ahead and drag those dicks all over the paper as you are wont to do, because that's why you're dick dragging Shane. So but I spent the previous week in South Carolina doing some business up there, and that wasn't a bad time. Great little food safe haven up there in Charleston, South Carolina. Fantastic place. I will also say that Chrono Trigger for the PC is not worth your time. Do not get it. Do not buy it.
No, it is not.
Because I bought it because it was on sale, and I'm an idiot because I bought it. And
I'm sorry. Don't you have a 3DS?
Yes, but on the 3DS, like an idiot, I didn't get that back when it was like $20. Because now it's like... Is that
like expensive now?
I wouldn't call it expensive, but I'm not going to pay $40 for a game I can emulate. So...
Touché.
I don't know why I do that. I mean, I'm not going to get all the extras and stuff, but I played a lot of Chrono Trigger for the PC just because I bought it, and I do love the game. It's kind of like pizza or sex. You know, no matter how bad it is, it's still not bad because it's Chrono Trigger.
Unless it involves pineapples.
But on pizza, that's great.
That is where you're wrong, kiddo.
Well, pineapples belong on pizza, and anyone who disagrees with me is Hitler. So,
they belong
as we
in the
move
trash.
forward...
Also, as a related
Chrono Trigger
I'm pretty sure that
still a good game.
3DS copy of Chrono Trigger is in physical form, so if you wanted to borrow that, you could totally do that.
But it's for the DS, not the 3DS.
Yeah, it works in both.
Oh. Touche. But I have a DS. I don't have it. Well, I do have a 3DS, but I just don't play it. My kids do. Any case, I'm getting off track. If you want to buy Chrono Trigger for the PC, do not do it. I'm going to tell you that right now. Do not do it. Do not do it. Do not do it. Emulate it if you have to. Just emulate it. $40 for a DS game is not worth it on the free market unless you can get it for free. Play it on your emulator of choice on your PC. I am advocating illegal activity. You are absolutely right. I don't care because the PC version is absolute dog shit. In addition to that, so I completed Kingdom Hearts, and of course the disc is scratched at the ending. So I was able to complete the game and beat the last boss, which of course was like the Ursula boss, which pisses me off because you just kind of float over to the guy and just hit X a bunch of times and hope that he doesn't spam one of his moves and kills you, and just repeatedly hit X. And there's no real strategy to it. You just figure out the magical part you're supposed to hit and you beat it up. But then it made it through the credits, and as soon as it got to the end of the credits, it just stopped working. So at least I can say I beat it. There's that.
There you go.
It's done. Yes. And I didn't mention this last episode, but I completed the World of Light thing in Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. And I will say Super Smash Bros. Ultimate is an amazing game. It's a lot of fun. I know Shane hates Smash Brothers, but I'm going to tell you this. I got Smash for the Wii U, and it is much better than that.
I can only meh so hard, Chris.
I think what enhanced it is I got one of those wireless GameCube controllers for the Switch, and it actually did enhance my gameplay experience. So there is that.
I suppose there is that.
So enough about me and my travels to South Carolina and my struggles with bullshit college professors and shitty versions of Chrono Trigger. How have you been doing, Shane?
I've been doing pretty good. Busy as usual, but I've been managing to find time to fit in the Vidya games where I can. Interestingly enough, and I feel like a lot of people can probably relate to this, in that I have, I don't even know, man, like, let's say a couple hundred games between Steam and the other platforms I own that I have yet to actually play. And yet I will still just go back and play the games that I played before. So, like, for instance, I, for whatever reason, decided to start a brand new Dark Souls remastered character a couple days ago.
Because why not?
Because why not? Because I felt like, you know what? I played through this game to completion before, and I had a pretty safe, like, strength and vitality, like heavy armor, sword and board kind of build. So I've played through all the Dark Souls, and I'm like about 3/4 of the way through Bloodborne right now. So you know what? I'm going to go back and I'm going to try to play a ninja. So like I've got light armor, and I am using the Uchigatana. So I'm just two-handing this giant katana sword, no shield. And turns out the game's a lot harder when you do it that way.
But you have to increase the difficulty. You already beat it.
I mean, I know you're kind of joking, but that is sort of true. Yeah, so I think, where the hell am I right now? Oh, I've got up to Sen's Fortress so far. And funnily enough, the thing that's made me stop playing that character for a while out of sheer frustration is just the fact that the environmental traps in Sen's Fortress are just a total bitch when you can't just use a shield to block projectiles from the cheap-ass lizard men that try to snipe you while you're walking across a fucking catwalk. So that's fun. So I don't know how much farther that run's gonna go, but spent a lot of time doing that. I also finished up leveling my seasonal character on my Switch for Diablo 3 and finished those objectives, so that was cool. I decided to go with a Blessed Hammer Crusader this time around, and that build is a hell of a lot of fun when you get the full set for it. Yeah, man. And then other than that, yeah, I'm plinking away at Kingdom Hearts 3, but that one's going slow because I only play when Brianna has time to sit and watch because she likes to see the story and everything. And at some point I'm gonna finish Bloodborne too, because I've still got that going.
The games you're talking about reminds me of two things. One is with Diablo. And that is, it just came out on Good Old Games.
Hell yeah!
And we are totally not being sponsored. The only reason I'm bringing that up, and I wish we were being sponsored by Blizzard.
But if you want to sponsor us, GOG, just give us a call.
I mean, Blizzard would be preferable, but GOG is fine too, because Blizzard has deeper pockets Maybe. I mean, their stock is tumbling, but we're not going to get too much into that. In any case,
Bobby Kotick, y'all.
Bobby Kotick needs to be fired. Never mind. I'm tangent. In any case, you can get it on Good Old Games, and the reason I bring this up is because that was one of my critiques of Diablo on our podcast, is that it was too hard to obtain. That was one of the reasons it didn't hold up. But hey, if you really want to go check it out, you can go check it out on Diablo, so I have to amend what I said there. The other thing is
Kingdom. Now you have no excuse.
No excuses. The other thing is Kingdom Hearts 3. I'm surprised by the negative reaction that I've seen from fans on like GameFAQs, and that's usually the barometer I use to see how the more hardcore fans are. And I noticed that you liked it, but I
do, yeah.
Shocked at the reviews that are coming from like the fan base that is fair to middling.
I won't spend too much time on this because we've already spent a lot of time anyway on the bantery stuff. But now that you mention that, there are a couple of legitimate gripes with it. I mean, I'm enjoying it, but then again, I'm the kind of person, and this applies to a lot of things like movies and TV shows, and something has to be really bad for me to not get some kind of enjoyment out of it. Like, for example, Iron Fist fucking sucked, and there's no saving that show, and I'm glad that one got canceled, and I'm sad that the other ones went down too. But I'm enjoying my time with Kingdom Hearts 3. It's fun to play. The systems feel good. The combat feels good. Some of the gripes with it are like not the summons, but the attraction system. That it actually makes the game way too easy, and they also pop up way too often. So you get these very long sort of animations that you can kind of skip, but it still takes a lot more time, and it just sort of trivializes a lot of fights. So there's really not much in the way of difficulty. Whether or not they're going to include like a critical mode or whatever, I guess remains to be seen. There's DLC that's coming, so maybe they'll do that, but I know that that's one, and I feel like maybe you could say more on this one because you've probably seen what people are saying more, but I think probably some of the story elements or whatever, which I don't know about because I'm trying not to spoil whatever happens in the second half of it, but yeah.
So currently it's sitting at a 3.83 out of 5 on GameFAQs from 9 reader reviews, which I still find shocking, and that might, a lot of those things you may have alluded to might be why, but I'm just upset. The thing that I'm upset is it's really simple, is that my disc wasn't clean enough for me to see the ending. And that's what upsets me.
I like how you worked both of those words into that sentence.
Enough about Kingdom Hearts and Squaresoft, though. We've been beating up Squaresoft and Disney and all things like that, Final Fantasy, and maybe until our next episode, and we promise we'll back off maybe. But
maybe
this week we're going back to the PC. We are going to go back to our first person shooter grit and grim roots and PC Master Race, even though that's not a thing. And that's what we're going to be doing. Yes, says me, and I'm always right. So Shane, what are we talking about this week?
We are talking about Descent,
the first person shooter in a fully 3D realm, sort of.
I mean, not really a sort of, but yeah, you know.
The PlayStation classic and masterpiece.
The MS-DOS masterpiece, yes.
Okay. But in any case, we will get into our diatribe shortly. But before we do that, Shane is going to give us a brief history of Descent.
The air in the briefing room is sterile, stale, and it stings your lungs. Your eyes burn from the garish electric blue of the digital schematics. Across the featureless hardwood conference table sits an emotionless suit, droning on in a way that would make even Armageddon sound boring. You've been contracted by the Post-Terran Mining Corporation, or PTMC, to solve a problem. Turns out, their autonomous mining robots have gotten themselves infected with some sort of virus, and they've decided now is the perfect time for the robot uprising. Being the hotshot mercenary pilot you are, you're being paid to descend into each of PTMC's planetary mining installations throughout the solar system and fix the problem. And by fix, they mean destroy. This is how you, the player, are jettisoned into the world of Descent, a 3D spacecraft-based first-person shooter developed by Parallax Software and released by Interplay in 1995. The game is known for allowing the player complete freedom of movement within a three-dimensional space, otherwise known as 6 degrees of freedom. Though technically not the first to accomplish this, games such as Afterburner also fit into this category. It is arguably the first notable entry into this relatively niche subset of games to boast a fully realized 3D environment. Piloting a spaceship, you play as a mercenary known by their call sign of Vertigo 1. You must navigate 30 distinct levels composed of labyrinthine mining tunnels, dispatching a deadly assortment of hostile robots and ultimately destroying each installation's reactor core. This, of course, triggers a self-destruct countdown, giving you mere seconds to find the mine's exit shaft and escape before the whole thing goes up in flames. Descent was originally developed for the MS-DOS platform by Parallax Software. Similar to most other titles of the era, Descent was developed using a software renderer, as 3D graphics cards did not exist in the mainstream at that time. A distinct difference, however, was that it was rendered its enemies using full 3D polygon meshes, while others, like Doom, used two-dimensional sprites. Descent would go on to be released in North America on March 17, 1995. Its initial incarnation was a shareware version, with the full game being released 3 months later. Mac OS, Acorn Archimedes, and PC-98 ports would also be released that same year, along with a modified version featuring stereoscopic graphics that was bundled with Stereographics SimulEyes VR 3D glasses. A year later, an enhanced version of Descent would be released for the Sony PlayStation. This version featured all original 30 levels, along with 5 new Anarchy levels, the remixed soundtrack found on the Mac OS port, pre-rendered cinematics, and improved lighting effects.
The best version.
Critical reception of Descent was nearly unanimously positive, with GameSpot giving it an 8 out of 10, praising the game for its interweaving environments and overall gameplay feel. Descent would go on to spawn 2 sequels, a trilogy of novels written by Peter Tellep, and serve as inspiration for several games that came in its wake. And that is your brief history of Descent.
All right, so what we have is a very, very interesting game, and I just want to bring up the fact that it is so interesting, is what you brought up at the beginning of it with the 6 degrees of freedom.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's really fair to compare Afterburner to Descent, just in the fact that Afterburner is an on-rails shooter, in the fact that you can't go back, you're not navigating through anything, of course, so... I know you said you wrote here in the notes that it's not really the first of its kind because you had a game called Star Cruiser for the PC-8800. If you want to get on that really quick.
Yeah, sure. So I wanted to call it the first, but as I said, technically it's kind of not. So Afterburner is sort of lumped into the 6 degrees of freedom category. Of games, and you're right, it doesn't necessarily fit that moniker 100% just because of the on-rails aspect of it, but it's fairly close, and there were a number of other titles actually that were released earlier than Descent that sort of also fit into this category, but the only one that got really, really close was in fact Star Cruiser, and that was released for the PC-8800 in 1988, so quite a time before Descent came out. And the main difference there is that it was actually really ahead of its time in that most of the environment was rendered polygonally, but the thing that's keeping it from, at least in my eyes, keeping it from being the first real fully 3D environment, 6 degrees of freedom style of game, is that it kind of had to make a compromise, probably due to the system hardware at the time, and use pre-rendered backgrounds, whereas Descent doesn't do that. Now, there are a couple of caveats with that, because we mentioned Doom, right, and the fact that all of its enemies are sprites.
Right.
Descent uses sprites also, but they only use it for item drops. So like your energy pickups and your shields and ammunition, those are all sprites. But
also when you're being fired upon, like missiles being fired at you.
Mm-hmm. Well, so that one actually, I'm not sure about that one. You're probably right, but I feel like in my experience, like the missile projectiles are actually 3D models.
That might be true. I know explosion so when you have an enemy firing, at least okay. I'm just gonna be blunt here. I played the PlayStation version, so obviously
this was gonna come up eventually.
Yeah, so. I'm going to be very brief, and before I go into my story there's not much of a story. I played the PlayStation version much later, but there's kind of a story behind that. But in any case, the PlayStation version, when enemies are firing missiles at you, or the big fireballs are coming at you, they're clearly sprites. When enemies explode, it's sprites. The lasers you fire on them, that could be debated if those are polygons. And the missiles you fire, that can be debated if it's polygons or sprites. So they look like polygons when you're firing the missiles. Now the enemy fire coming at you, that seems to be sprites. And of course the items are sprites. And I think the explosions look a lot like sprites. And that was common for the day, even going to the N64, which of course, was focused on polygonal rendering. That explosions in the N64 were spritey as hell. Just go play any N64 game that's heavy in terms of explosives.
Yeah, no, you're right. And I'd actually be interested to look more into that one because I don't know as far as the projectiles. And it could just be that they just used really good sprites to trick me into thinking that they're 3-dimensional. But my brain is telling me that the missiles, at the very least, are polygonal objects. I think the lasers and like the spread fire cannon and I think those projectiles are probably sprites because there wouldn't be much of a reason to render those in 3D, I think, at least at the time. But yeah, you're right. Like the explosions and the mining employees, the hostages who you save, like those are all sprites as well. But the big difference is really the enemies, because there are a varied amount of different enemy types in the game, and there are unique 3D models for each one, which is really cool and was still fairly uncommon at the time. Actually, most notably, Quake 1 would be the next major first-person shooter to have polygonal meshes for enemies, actually, and that came out like a year later, I believe.
And that's interesting because Quake really does get that credit for being one of the first-person shooters for doing that. But you look at when Descent came out in 1995, they were really doing something different. They were really setting some standards. So because Shane is a super fan, I'll let him talk more about it, because you probably played Descent closer to its release back in 95, right? I'm assuming.
Yeah, I did actually. I don't think it was right at release. I feel like I've talked about this before on the podcast, so it's actually very possible that if we have some very meticulous listeners out there, that they could probably call me out and tell me that I'm just making shit up. But memory being what it is, I know that my family got our first like computer for the whole family. The Compaq Presario that I've mentioned before. I want to say it was like around 96, I think. And the fun thing about that one was, and my parents didn't even know this, I don't think, when they bought it, because they had no idea what any of this was. But young little me was super pumped about the fact that this brand new computer that we just bought for the house also got packaged with a copy of Descent, and also Magic Carpet, which was less fun. And maybe we'll do an episode about that game at some point.
Which you have told me is utter and total trash. Listen, ported to everything.
Listen, man. I mean, there are some defenders out there that will tell you that game is just underappreciated and like you just don't get it, man. But that game is garbage.
I've never played it, and I've never had the inclination to. So I cannot say that it is good or bad. I've only heard things that don't make me really want to play it.
Yeah.
I just don't care about Magic Carpet. Sorry.
I mean, that's a fair assessment of Magic Carpet, really. But yeah, so like Descent came packaged with this computer, which was awesome. So like this is actually one of the first PC games I ever played. So in a way, that was, at least for me, it was pretty cool because like up until this point, I had only played, I still owned a Super Nintendo at that time, right? And so my experience with games was just sprites, just the 2D games. And then to have this computer come along and install Descent, which by the way, at the time, if you weren't there, you totally missed out on the personal hell that it was trying to get games to run on MS-DOS half the time. Mm-hmm. But when you actually got it running, it was amazing. It was the first time I had seen a game where you could move in any direction in a 3D space. And of course now going back and looking at it, it looks kind of like dog shit, just like a lot of N64 games. But at the time, the graphics were incredible. And yeah, I played a lot of Descent, a lot. I don't even know how many times I finished the game, like played through all 30 levels, but I put a lot of time into that one. But I know that you have your own opinion of it, that you feel that the PlayStation version is superior. So why don't you elaborate a little bit on why you think that is?
Okay, so before I get into this, I'm going to say too long, don't read. The PlayStation version is the best version to play as long as you have the right controller. So let me get into my story because it starts all the way back in the mid-90s, much like Shane.
In the before time.
So my computer, I had like a Mac that you could switch in between Mac OS and Windows 3.1. It had both OSs on it. It had both system architecture on it. I don't remember what it was called. It was a dual boot. And this was back in the mid 90s. So it was to me, it was interesting. So you had 3.1 in Mac OS, whatever the hell it was back then.
Well, so I didn't know I was recording a podcast with an aristocrat.
But you have to understand, my dad is very into technology, and if you know who my dad is, you would understand this. I'm not going to pipe him up too much, but he's very involved.
Does your dad work for Nintendo?
No, he does not work for Nintendo. But he is very much into the industry as far as C++ goes. He's one of the C++ pioneers back in the day. Worked at Bell Labs. At least he claims to have worked at Bell Labs during the development of, and I tend to believe him because he is still successful in that field. In any case, nice. And now we went on tangent, my dad. I had a friend at school, and I was talking about how great, video games were on the Super Nintendo and all that stuff like that, and consoles were the greatest things ever. And they said, I have this game called Descent, and it's shareware, so I can give you a copy. Of course, I have no idea what any of these things mean. So I think he gave me a copy. I remember his name was Ryan. Not going to give last names, of course, but his name was Ryan, and I had another from Matt, and they had these copies of Descent. They couldn't stop raving about Descent. So they gave me a floppy disk, or a couple of floppy disks, and said, yeah, just put this in your computer. If you have Windows 3.1, it won't work on Mac. And I said, why not? Because my entire life was just all Mac computers, and anything that wasn't a Mac was inferior. Of course, I was wrong. But I took these floppies, I put them in my computer, went to Windows 3.1, and couldn't figure out what the hell to do. I think someone eventually got it running for me, but the computer was just couldn't run it. I don't know why. I don't think I had a 3D graphics processor because the computer wasn't developed for games. It was just more developed between word processing and, translating, Windows programs and Mac programs. I'm not sure. I didn't know anything about architecture back then.
Clearly you needed a turbo button.
Clearly I needed something. Turbo button would have worked. I should have plugged in my TurboGrafx computer controller that I did not have, or my Sega Megafire, which I did have, into my computer. Maybe it would have worked. But I didn't have that serial port. In any case, so years and years and years go by. In fact, let's go back to 4 years ago, 2015. So if you do the math, that's about 20-year difference almost. And it starts out with me going to the best local video game store in Jacksonville, called Video Game Rescue. I know I'm not going to get too much into Video Game Rescue. I would say they're cool. Go see them. Now I'm just talking too much, and I know that's making Shane irritated. In any case, sorry, Shane. In any case, they have the PlayStation analog flight stick controller, and I'd never really seen one in the flesh, and this is why my story is getting long, because if for those who don't know, there were analog controllers before the DualShock. You had the analog flight controller, which came out, or analog flight stick, or whatever the hell you want to call it, analog joystick controller, that came out with the system, or shortly after the system in either 95 or 96. And this thing is massive. It's probably one of the biggest first-party controllers ever made. It's not quite as big as the Steel Battalion controller for the Xbox, but it is a big controller, especially from a first party.
But then nothing is, really.
No, nothing is. Nothing compares. But it's similar in style. So if you haven't seen one before, it has two joysticks in the center. It's about, what, you say about 2 feet long? About 2 feet wide?
Sounds about right.
About 2 feet wide. Has two joysticks in the center, and it has 8 buttons in the middle, of course, which is your triangle, circle, square, X, L1, R1, R2, L2. And all these buttons, of course, are still on the flight stick controllers. So, and it comes with a hat switch too, which is kind of acts as your D-pad, even though the controllers themselves act as a D-pad. But the semantics on the controllers aside, this thing is really cool. And it was Sony's first analog controller, which also has functionality on their second analog controller, which is never talked about, and I'm not going to get into it here because no one talks about it. Just know that the analog controller doesn't rumble, and it has convex analog joysticks as opposed to... It has concave as opposed to convex analog joysticks. In any case, I found this controller, and I was like, I really need to get it. So I was able to get a good deal for it. I think at the time I got it for $20. And I was like, okay, now I have this massive, cool controller. What the fuck do I play it with?
Microsoft Flight Simulator.
Yeah, exactly. Because that's the kind of collector I was. I was like, what the fuck do I play with this thing? It's just cool. I just wanted to get cool shit that I thought was cool. And I started looking it up. It's like, oh, okay, Descent. I remember Descent. I was able to get it, I think, off like a Goodwill Books back then, when Goodwill Books on eBay was one of the smokingest hot deals you can get. I think I got Descent for like $4 long box for the PlayStation. And nice. As soon as I got it in, I was like, let me fire this up. And I'm going to tell you, the gameplay is absolutely divine with this, because I don't understand how you play it on a computer the way you do it, just because it has the way you do it, because the two joysticks control all 3 facets of aviation. So you have your hat switch that will allow you to strafe. So if you have the hat switch that's on your right analog joystick, if you go left or right, you strafe, left or right, you press up or down, you strafe up or down. Your thrust is on your left joystick, so if you press forward, you're going to go forward, thrusting. Back, you're going to go back, thrust. Then you go to your roll is also on your left joystick, so left will roll your craft, and right will roll it right. And then your pitch is controlled by your right joystick, so going up or down. So you push forward, you're going to go however you want, into whether or not you want to invert it. I invert it, so when I push forward, I go down. When I pull back, I go up. And then it'll also control your yaw. So if you go right, it will turn your craft. If you turn left or right, will essentially make your craft turn left or right into the direction you want to go to. So you have complete freedom of movement over what it is, and of course the triggers will control how you fire.
I mean, that's all I've ever looked for in life, is just how to control my yaw, man.
Yaw is important, man. Yaw is the most underrated way of doing things. It's kind of like when they say do a barrel roll and you're doing an aileron roll. But
I'm so glad you brought that up.
Yes.
Common misconception.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So okay. I mean, I could answer that. So honestly, I think a lot of it just comes from like years of ingrained practice, really. Like, so obviously since Descent, I played it on the PC first, and I've never actually played any other version. I've always used a keyboard and mouse, and granted, the default key mapping in Descent is hot garbage, so don't use that.
Well, this before WASD was really popular, right?
Well, right, yeah. So that's the thing, is this was before the whole WASD thing, when who was the first one to do that? Was it Half-Life? Maybe? I want to say it was Half-Life. I could be wrong about that.
Yeah, because Doom used arrows.
Yeah, which I used to play it that way too back in the day, and I don't know how the hell I did that now. But anyway, yeah, I want to say Half-Life was the first to really do that. But anyway, change your key mappings for sure. Like, do WASD, and then like your rolls. This is what I do, and it works out well enough. Like, my roll is on Q and E, so roll left, roll right. I think I remapped my bombs to my space bar, and like your auto map is tab, and then flares is F. So it's like it's all right there, so you don't really have to move your hand at all. And then this was also, I didn't mention it in the history because there was a lot of technical stuff we could have talked about, but it would have taken up a lot of time. This was also one of the first games in that era to really make use of mouse look. Because
it had to.
Well, yeah, that's the thing, is it had to, right? Because, I mean, something like Doom, which was out right around the same time, you can use mouse look now, and I don't recall if it was built in originally when it first came out or not. But honestly, it'd be weird for that game because you don't have full 6 degrees of freedom anyway, so you kind of don't need it. You can, control yourself just fine without it. But this game, if you didn't have mouse look, then you'd be fucked. Like, unless you were using a joystick or a controller, which were also built-in options with the PC release as well. So if you were one of those people that had, like one of those flight sticks or something that you could hook up to your PC, you could totally use that, even back then. But yeah, I don't know. It's always worked fine for me. Like, it's felt natural. I do have to change the default settings for like the mouse look to reverse what they have by default, because I always thought it felt weird. With the up and down pitch with the mouse. But that's a problem that I have with a lot of games where they default it to one way and it just doesn't feel right. So, But other than that, I mean, I've never had an issue with it. Now, granted, I would actually like, as much as I'm going to be on one side of the fence here and you'll be on the other as far as defending versions of this game, I actually would like to try the PlayStation version with that controller you have, because it does look really cool, and I have feeling... When did I do that?
This was like 3 years ago. Is it one of your bad movie parties?
Did you actually bring that?
Yes.
Shit, man. I don't remember. Well, I don't remember any of it, so I gotta play it again then.
Yes.
But anyway, I feel like, I don't know, did I have a good time with it?
You seem to, but I think your bias towards the PC version was there. And I will say I can understand that, because frame rate, because I watched some footage from Descent on the PC, and it's a much cleaner image. The frame rate is higher and movement is smoother. And that's just typical of PC versus console releases back then. That's to be expected. I mean, the same was for Doom and just pretty much any PC release back in the day. The PC version, graphically and performance-wise, was and still is the superior performance. It's just the control. I was going to say, like, you could
make that argument now still too, but
yeah. So I mean, that criticism is fair. So what I would like to do is I would like to play the PC version with that control setup.
Yeah, which actually is a great segue, because I was going to mention because we like to talk about whether or not this is something people can play now, right? And they totally can. It is available on Good Old Games. That's actually where I bought it again from, because alas, I think I lost my original Descent disc somewhere in the many moves that have occurred in my life since I was like 14. But I rebought it there, and if you're gonna go and play it, you can play it just stock as it is, and in its original form. But I would highly suggest going out and downloading the DX Rebirth mod. It makes the whole experience so much better on modern hardware. So you can purchase it legally on Good Old Games, and then go find the Rebirth mod and install that. It's super easy to install. Actually, it comes in an installer for you, so you don't really even have to think about it. And when you run it that way, it gives you newer high-res textures for pretty much everything. It adds like translucency effects to items like your shield orbs and things like that. It also supports better modern native resolutions like widescreen and 1080p and things like that. It also includes what I think was the remix soundtrack from the Mac OS version, which a lot of people argue is a better version of the soundtrack than the original. But that's what I've been playing recently, leading up to this episode. And it's one of those deals where it makes the game feel like how your brain remembers it. It's kind of like the Ocarina of Time effect, where like playing the 3DS version, you're like, yeah, this looks like how Ocarina of Time should look. And then you go and fire up an N64 and you're like, oh no. Oh no.
Yeah, they didn't age like you thought it would.
They really don't. Yeah. But so I had a couple of things before we sort of like wrap up this episode that I kind of wanted to touch on, as far as just like things that I think are really cool, honestly, about the game. Because if it's not like self-evident at this point, I think it's safe to say that both Chris and I enjoy this game and would recommend it. I know I certainly do.
But briefly before you get into that, because you kind of touched on whether or not it holds up. I will say this: if you do not have a PlayStation Dual analog joystick, and that's the big fucking tank stick, the one with the two massive, dick-shaped phallic symbols coming out of a arcade-looking machine board, don't bother. It is an absolute terror to play with the original PlayStation controller. Don't do it. It's not worth your time. But if you do have the analog joystick, both Descent and Descent Maximum are very much worth your investment. That's the only way to play it on PlayStation. But if you do not have that controller, it's not worth your time. It does not hold up. Don't even try. There it is.
Now, that's fair. I mean, the original PlayStation controller didn't even have sticks, right? So that must be a fucking nightmare to try to play a game with 6 degrees of movement. Right. I can't even imagine wanting to do that.
It may be compatible with the DualShock, but the fact that the analog sticks themselves have all the buttons you need on them, and strafing is such an important part of that game, and strafing is mapped to the D-pad while movement is mapped to your D-pads. I mean, your analog sticks. It's just an absolute nightmare on how to control, how to switch your weapons, how to fire. It's not worth it.
Yeah, I gotcha. So just really quickly, just a couple of things to note that I just personally really love about Descent, and it's something that I kind of came back to me as I've been replaying it more recently. It's really well crafted. You could make the argument, and some people did even at release, that it's somewhat simplistic in the gameplay. It's mostly just like you go into the level, you explore the level, shoot enemies, they blow up, you find key cards to open doors, and you blow up the reactor and leave. And that's more or less the gist of just about every one of the 30 levels of the game. They mix that formula up a little bit on a few occasions, where rather than the end of the level being a reactor that shoots at you, it's an actual boss character, which is cool. But I would say that there's actually some manner of elegance in its simplicity, in that it's just fun. It's really, really fun, as long as your controls are set up properly, of course, to navigate these, this labyrinth of mining tunnels and fighting these robotic enemies. And there are quite a few different types of enemies, so it keeps things varied in that way. And it can definitely ramp up the difficulty, especially for people who are not used to having to sort of keep an eye on their six, as it were, because you're not used to having that much freedom of movement. You can have enemies coming at you from quite literally any angle. So that sort of makes it, you kind of have to have your head on a proverbial swivel most of the time. But to me, I think that actually adds to the experience. And the ending sequence for each level, where ultimately you find the reactor core of that particular mine and you have to blow it up, you get about, I think it's 50 seconds.
45.
Is it 45?
At least in the PlayStation version, it's 45.
I feel like the PC version is 50. But at any rate, you have less than a minute to escape and find the exit tunnel and get out of there before the whole place explodes. Now, the idea being that, if you know that's coming, you should have probably found where the exit door is before you go and blow up the reactor. Otherwise, you're probably kind of screwed. But that extra level of tension at the end of every level, I think, is brilliant. Because there are times where some of the levels are huge and it will take a while to get through them, and they are pretty windy. The wireframe auto map that you have helps to sort of keep you on track as far as navigating where you need to go. But it is very possible that you will kind of tend to lose your way, or things will kind of drag for a while on some of the bigger levels. So having that sort of rush of adrenaline at the end of every one is kind of a nice punctuation, I think, to the end of each of the mining areas. So overall, I just think it's a lot of fun. It's fairly straightforward, but it does what it does really well. I personally can't really find too many flaws with it.
I would say it's a bit long. I would say 30 levels is a bit too much.
You think so?
There's not much deviation between the levels.
True. That is true. Yeah, I mean, your environments really don't change up too much. I mean, I feel like they kind of do what they can, but I kind of almost feel like they were constrained by their own plot devices, right? Like if their whole premise is, well, I don't know, this company has like a whole bunch of mining colonies on planets, they're probably going to look all pretty much the same. I mean,
but to use Diablo as an example, if the entire game of Diablo, if they had 30 levels, and I think Diablo has more than that, I'm not sure how much it has, but if it had 30 levels and every single level looked like the first set of levels for the entire game, it would get kind of, even if like you increase the challenge of every level, and then the boss in every level was the same essentially, except for a few, which kind of Diablo does do, it would be viewed as kind of tedious. And I think,
I mean, to be fair, if there was like 30 levels of the cathedral in Diablo, I'd play that. So. But I'm biased, so
Right. If you had 30 cathedral levels, I don't think it would be as much of a success. And I think that's kind of why Descent kind of gets forgotten about today, even as fun of a game that it is. It's just the same pretty much game with larger, more labyrinthine levels as you go forward, and it doesn't really change too much. Whereas Doom did, and Wolfenstein kind of did, and that came before, and Quake certainly did. So you have all these big first-person shooters coming in around the same time, and Descent just has that different kind of control, but it's samey the entire game through. So if they had probably made about 15, 20 levels, and they made that game, and they probably added more variety to those levels, I think it would have stood the test of time in terms of being in people's memory a lot more than it had. Because in terms of the test of time, we both agree that it's completely fun, completely playable. You will enjoy yourself, but it needs a palette swap every once in a while. It's just very, very similar the entire way through.
No, I think that's a fair assessment, and to in the interest of full transparency, even though I said I've played this many times, which I have, I've played it many times, but I've never actually finished it many times. I have, but in the number of times that I've gone back and picked it up again over and over, I probably get roughly halfway through the game, and then I feel like I've gotten my fill of Descent for a while. So yeah, no, I see where you're coming from on that. Maybe if they had, and even if they didn't vary up the environments, although I do think that is a good point, even if they didn't, perhaps just due to limitations or what have you, I think paring down the levels and maybe, pruning.
Changing objectives?
Yeah, maybe changing the objectives, but honestly, maybe even just as simple as pruning some of the, lesser levels, the ones that are maybe a little less enjoyable, and paring it down from 30 to, like you said, maybe 20 might have ended up giving people just a tighter experience, and then you wouldn't end up maybe feeling sort of like burnt out on it before you actually got through the whole thing. Yeah, so no, that's totally fair.
So speaking of which, there is a reboot for Descent coming out this year, or supposed to.
Supposedly. Yeah, the current release date is targeted somewhere around this year. I don't know if they said exactly when, but that was was it a Kickstarter?
I'm not sure. I just know that there's a reboot coming out this year, and there was a Kickstarter for that made by a lot of the original creators of Descent.
Yeah. So a number of the original members of Parallax had actually successfully kickstarted sort of a spiritual successor to Descent, and they called that one Overload, and that was released May of 2018. Actually, I personally have not had a chance to check it out, but the reception of it has been generally very positive. So I'm probably going to get around to actually looking at that at some point. Have you had a chance to check that out at all?
I have not, actually, and your showing us is the first time I've even heard of it. So it does give inspiration. But I do think it is interesting that these are starting to crop up now, just because there's not really anything like Descent in terms of how they executed it, the fluidity in which they did it, the range of control that you do have. It's very unique, and even with it being such a success, that control scheme only really stuck to Descent in terms of a first-person shooter. It never really branched off all too much, and the first-person shooter more evolved the Doom route. And Descent itself, unfortunately, you don't see a lot of games in that vein or in that gameplay, at least ones that are extremely popular.
Yeah, no, you don't really. Around that time, of course, there was, as is, what usually happens, like take battle royales, for example, currently. Mm-hmm. There was a kind of a spate of games that came out that tried to emulate what Descent was doing because of its success, and they had varying degrees of success with that. But outside of that somewhat limited time frame around when Descent was like new and popular, not a lot of games have really tried that. And if I had to guess, I'd say it's probably partly due to what I mentioned before about just player awareness. Just having anything coming at you from any angle can be disorienting sometimes. And the fact that more often than not, you will end up inadvertently kind of like, flipping yourself upside down, and then you have to roll to get back in the right position. And I know that can certainly affect some people if you've got like motion sickness issues or things like that. So. Uh-huh.
Well, this episode is going long in the tooth. So, Shane, do you have any closing remarks on Descent?
It's a super fun space shooter where you blow up robots and destroy reactors, and you should play it if you haven't. And even if you did, you should go back and play the DX Rebirth mod because it's awesome. That's all I have to say.
Outstanding. I have nothing further to say on Descent, but I will plug our friend Seamus's channel, Gray Man Games.
The Gray Man.
The Gray Man. He has been faithfully plugging us all week, the week that he was on the podcast. So thank you, Seamus. We do appreciate it. You've been doing great things on your channel. Continue to do great work. I think right now he's doing a Resident Evil 2 playthrough. So if you go over there and check that out, you can also check him out on www.spburke.com, which is Burke. I will give that shout out to him. Once again, thank you, Seamus, for being on the show. Other than that, I really have nothing further for this episode. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Retro Hangover Podcast. Shane?
I think that about sums it up. I've got one quick thing that I want to throw out there. I know on a few episodes in the past we've mentioned our streaming habits and the fact that we haven't really been doing a whole lot of it. Honestly, that's due to a number of factors, both technical and just life. We just haven't necessarily had time to fit that in, but we're trying to shoot for setting up more of a regular schedule now. So you might find that this episode is not going to age very well because we might not stick to this, and then this is going to make us sound dumb. But hey, the plan is to try to do some regular streaming on Sunday nights. So that'll be Retro Hangovers Stream Sunday. We're shooting for 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and it'll be just a couple of hours once every week. But we want to try to get on stream and maybe interact with some of you fine folks and play the games that we talk about on our episodes.
Or at least similar ones.
Yeah, or at least similar if for whatever reason we can't actually properly stream the one that we are discussing. But at least something to that effect. So keep an eye out for that. If we do, go live, our social media accounts will be updated accordingly. So if you are free on Sunday evenings and got nothing better to do, feel free to jump in and watch us play some good old retro games.
And really quick before we wrap this up, Shane, any final closing remarks once again?
I don't know. Should I?
I guess not. So, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube. God. Find us. RetroHangover.com, podcast at RetroHangover.com is the email. I don't think we've gotten any emails recently unless you're a Russian bot. In that case, thank you. And I don't know how to say thank you in Russian. I should have thought about that before I said that. And God damn it. I wanted to bring up one more final point. Oh, yeah. Next week, we will go into Shane's all-time favorite game that he has been, no doubt, dutifully been playing in preparation for the episode next week. And I cannot look forward more to this episode than anybody else in this entire world, Shane. Don't you agree?
Yes, I'm really looking forward to discussing Hello Kitty Island Adventure.
Yes, the Labyrinth Edition. So, we look forward to that. And until then, keep playing with your joysticks, especially if they're attached to a giant phallic PlayStation-like device. Have a good night, or day, or whatever you're doing. Bye.